Good afternoon, and thank you so much for coming. On behalf of the Klaus Center for Civil and Human Rights, welcome. My name is Jen Mason-McAward. I'm the director of the newly endowed and just launched Klaus Center, and this is our inaugural lecture, and I can think of no speaker or topic that more closely aligns with our mission of promoting justice and human dignity. It's my privilege to introduce to you Alexander McLean, the founder and director of the African Prisons Project. As a teenager, Alexander left his home in the United Kingdom to volunteer at a hospital in Kampala, Uganda. And during that trip, he visited and treated a group of prisoners. Struck by their dire living conditions, he bought materials and supervised the renovation of the prison infirmary. He then returned home and created the African Prisons Project to serve prisoners in both Uganda and Kenya. The project enables both prisoners and prison guards to work together and study law remotely from the University of London. Armed with the knowledge and the power of the law, these changemakers are advocating for the rights of prisoners in the criminal system and are working to enhance prison health care and vocational training programs. In all, it's just a remarkable program that recognizes and promotes the human dignity of the least among us. And so we are fortunate to learn from and be inspired by Alexander today. So please join me in welcoming him to Notre Dame.
Thanks, Jen. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here. Jen, thank you for the invitation to give this talk. This is an amazing university. This is my first visit, and I've only spent just over a day here. I've been moved by the wonderful facilities you have, the amazing technology, but most of all by the people I've met. And Jen, thanks to you and Dory and Kevin and Anne for the humility with which you welcomed me, the warmth with which you made me feel at home here. I think it's one thing to have an amazing environment, but it's another to have kind people. I've received that in abundance from you. Thank you. I feel privileged to be here the day after the launch of the newly endowed Klaus Center for Civil and Human Rights. Rick and Molly, it's been great spending a little bit of time getting to know you. I'm grateful to your son, Rick, for his support for our work, for his making the connection to Jen, and for being our ambassador. I'm also grateful to my mum for being here. I've been working in prisons in East Africa for just over 14 years, and during that time, my mum and dad and sister, wife, children, friends and in-laws have been by my side, often coming with me to unexpected places, feeling totally uncomfortable, but being there to support me. So I'm grateful for you being here with me today, having another adventure together. As I've been reading a little bit about Notre Dame and trying to understand what this place stands for, Father Ted's name has come up again and again. I watched some videos of him speaking. I was moved by his commitment to human rights at a time when not everyone was paying attention to them. I was moved by the fact that he was a man of conviction. It seemed that he didn't worry about aligning himself with issues which might have been unfashionable if he felt that they were the right ones to be aligned with, and if he felt that the Holy Spirit was leading him towards them. For me, I've got huge respect for people who have the courage of their convictions. And I think when it comes to working in prisons in Africa, as someone who's not from that continent, when it comes to aligning ourselves with people that most of the world doesn't care about, conviction is a very necessary thing. I'm grateful for Father Ted's global perspective and the posture with which he formed this university, looking out to the world and looking out to those on the margins of it, saying they belong to us and we have a duty to them. Let us love them and grow together. I was moved by his comment about the university when he said, "I would hope that if Notre Dame makes a difference in the whole world, at the heart of that difference would be a commitment to human rights, human dignity, and human accomplishment." And I think the Klaus Center will play a hugely important role in that. Thank you, Klaus Center members and benefactors, for following in Father Ted's footsteps. Thank you for being here. I know that there's a lot going on in prisons in America at the moment, and when it comes to criminal justice issues, often we think about what happens in our own backyard. Most of you and me live thousands of miles away from the people I'm going to tell you about today. I hope that over the course of this hour we spend together, we'll be reminded that we have a shared humanity, regardless of our nationality or the language we speak or the circumstances in which we are born. I believe that what's happening in prisons in East Africa has something to speak into the situation in prisons in America, as questions are asked about what role we want prisons to play in our society. What role do those who've been in prison have to play in the rest of our lives? We've a newly established 501c3, and we're asking, what does it look like to build community in the US? Who will come on this journey with us as we work to bring justice and dignity and hope to people on the very margins of our society? It's been wonderful to see our work featured recently by CNN and by Time magazine and by PBS. And I hope that over the course of this hour, you'll be inspired by the fact that in the midst of circumstances which are filled with challenges, there's amazing hope and remarkable people who are working with courage to change their lives and the lives of others in their community. A few weeks ago, I gave a talk at Thésée in France. I don't know if any of you have heard of it. I can see a nod at the back. It's an ecumenical Christian community. About 100,000 people visited each year, many of them young adults, for a week spent in dialogue, contemplation, and thrice daily at times of prayer in the huge Thésée church, singing simple passages from Scripture. While I was there, within a few hours, I'd met people who'd been in prison. I met others who were hugely burdened by the things that they'd done to hurt others, and some who'd been massively wounded by things that others had done to them. Regardless of what's been done to you or what you've done to others, you're welcome here this afternoon. The African Prisons Project is wondering what it might look like to be a prophetic witness, a group of people from different nationalities and different backgrounds, some of us imprisoned and some of us free, working to move to the margins of our societies, saying the law serves you as well. You too have a right to access justice. The law protects you. I grew up in London. Since I was a little boy, I'd wanted to be a barrister, a court attorney. I was intrigued by the idea that one person's argument could affect another's liberty. And I was inspired when I was very small, reading about the death penalty, especially the death penalty in the US, and trying to get my head around how the state could kill to show that killing was wrong. I was also inspired as I read about people like Martin Luther King and Mandela, and understood how groups that were oppressed by the state could begin to interact with the law, recognizing that the law affects us all from before we're born until after we die, and how it could be this amazing tool for liberation and freedom for people who've sometimes been oppressed for generations. We didn't have loads of money growing up, but the British government used to pay for poor but bright children to go to fee-paying schools, and I got one such assisted place. My plan was to go to Oxford to study geography and then to do law afterwards. I was fascinated by the world and the people in it, and the role that the law could play in serving them. When I was 16, I started volunteering at a hospice in London, thinking that if I was going to get into Oxford, I needed to have some good voluntary experience on my application form. Each Sunday afternoon, I'd spend time with the dying patients and their families. I realized I could learn a huge amount from those coming to the end of their lives. Also that none of us can take life for granted, regardless of how young we are. I remember in my first few weeks there meeting a 19-year-old girl with a brain tumor. Her whole head was bandaged up and she lay unable to move as she was close to death. So for those of you who are students here, don't put off following your dreams or your calling or the things that bring you joy or excitement until you have enough education or you have enough money or you have enough connections. What we have is now. I hope that today you'll do the things which bring you joy and satisfaction. At 16, I read about a hospice in Uganda. Based in Kampala, Uganda's capital, they were going to people's homes, providing morphine and food as people died of AIDS and cancer. Their work sounded fascinating, and I wrote asking if I could volunteer, but they said at 16 I was too young. So I continued. I finished my high school education. Oxford rejected me, saying I couldn't think laterally. I decided to take a year out. The hospice in Uganda said now I was 18, they'd have me. So I went out and initially spent a month going on home visits with their doctors and nurses, shadowing as they cared for their patients. I was moved by the compassion that they showed and the grace with which people who were dying in really difficult circumstances received me and responded to their situation. But I didn't feel I could do much to help. Sometimes a nurse would ask me to say a prayer. That was my contribution. But one day we went to Malago, Uganda's national referral hospital, where the hospice was taking morphine to a man dying on one of the general medical wards. The hospice team went off to see their patient, and I saw a man lying on the floor by the toilet on this ward. He was naked. I said to a nurse, "What's going on with this guy?" She said, "Well, the police found him unconscious in a market. We don't know his name or if he's got any relatives. We think he's diabetic and in a diabetic coma. And we're waiting for him to die. Because he doesn't have family, he doesn't get food or washed or treatment." As I got closer to him, I saw that he was lying semi-comatose in a pool of urine, and the flesh in his bottom and back was rotten down to the bone. I went to the hospice I was staying at, and I spoke to Anne Merriman, the woman who founded it, a former Benedictine nun and a doctor working in Africa since 1960. Now she's in her mid-80s, but goes around Africa helping to establish hospices. She taught me that we're never too old to serve. She said, with someone like that, even if he's dying, he can die when he feels loved and cared about. So I went back the next day and bought a basin and soap and a towel, found a nurse trained by the hospice. We tied bandages around our noses because of how his rotting flesh stank, and we washed him together. We got him some clothes and some sheets, and I tried to feed him and to advocate for him with the doctors and nurses, saying, although this man has no money or family, can you not care for him? For 5 days I washed him and fed him and advocated for him. I came on the 6th day, and he had died the night before. He was lying dead and naked on the floor. And after a while, a porter came with a trolley with a dead woman on it and put the man's body on top of the woman. It said they'd be buried in a mass grave together with everyone else who had no one to bury them. It was a turning point in my life because I realized that there are people in our world whose lives are judged to have no value. I spent 3 months on that ward with patients dying of AIDS, with tuberculosis, who'd been abandoned by their family, washing them and feeding them and accompanying them as they died. It was an amazing time of formation for me, and I saw it was a privilege to journey with those who'd been pushed out by society, and that there was possibility to create a beautiful community in looking after them, and student nurses would come and help take care of these patients, or the gardener from the hospice I was staying at. We'd look after them together. In this hospital I met prisoners. They were usually teenage boys in prison for having underage sex. It's one of the most common offences in Uganda and has a maximum penalty of death. Often they'd been in prison for years without trial. In hospital, they could die of starvation or dehydration because the doctors and nurses would shun them. I met a prisoner called Fred Muburu. He was in prison for stealing a goat. He'd been waiting for trial a year. He worked at a prison farm. The prison staff had beaten him, and he had a wound in his back. He got tetanus in it, and over a number of weeks I accompanied him as he died from it. Or another prisoner called Robert Mukubia. He was 21, he had a number of children. He was in prison for stealing cassava, a root vegetable, worth something like $5. When I met him, he'd been in prison for 6 months. He was dying of cancer and AIDS. It was said that he was too sick to go to court, so it looked like he'd die a prisoner, not because his offence carried a long sentence, but because the prison authorities didn't understand what to do with him. We went to court on his behalf and spoke to the judge and managed to secure him his freedom, and he got home the day before he died. This experience of meeting prisoners in hospital made me wonder what life was like for the rest of the prisoners at Luzira prisons, Uganda's main prison complex. So I managed to bulldoze my way in to Luzira maximum security prison. Built in 1927, and Uganda was a British colony for about 600 inmates. Today it's got almost 4,000. I went to death row, which was built for 50, and then had 500. People sentenced to death for treason or cowardice or mutiny. I was told of someone who'd stolen a mango from a neighbour's mango tree. because he used a penknife to cut it off and he'd stolen. He was an armed robber and had to be sentenced to death. I went into the prison hospital, and as I went in, a teenage boy died. The place stank. They said it hadn't been painted since the 1950s. His body was sewn up in a blanket and he'd go in a mass grave. I thought that no one deserved to die in such an environment, especially in a country where about 60% of prisoners hadn't been convicted of any offence, and people could be in prison for years without trial. So I went back to the UK for a couple of weeks, spoke to my friends, family, old school and church, raised about £5,000, returned to Kampala, visited every hotel asking for mattresses and blankets and bedsheets, working with the prisoners and prison staff, refurbished that prison hospital, putting in lights and solar panels and furniture, so that if prisoners were going to die there, they at least died when they felt their lives had value. But we saw that the death rate at that prison dropped massively after the refurbishment, because the prison service installed a laboratory so diseases could be diagnosed on site. The prison doctors and nurses started coming to work more often, and I realized that if you give employees a dignified environment and the right tools, and say the work that you're doing is valuable, it motivates them. They go the extra mile. I went off to Notre University to start studying law. After just over a year there, I started the African Prisons Project when I was 21 to bring dignity and hope and justice to people in prison. Initially, our work was around establishing libraries and clinics, believing that improved prison infrastructure would bring dignity to people in prison. But actually, we saw that by themselves, buildings didn't change that much. So then we started bringing in librarians and counsellors and teachers to run adult literacy classes and mother and baby reading groups in the prisons we worked in. We saw that the needs were great, and that the lives of prison staff were about as difficult as those of prisoners. We couldn't ignore their needs as well, because otherwise we'd create resentment. So for most of our 10 years, we thought, how do we improve the welfare of people in prison? How do we respect their basic human rights? We tried all sorts of things. We established a program to train prisoners and prison officers to provide basic health education and diagnosis and treatment in prisons which don't have doctors or nurses or a clinic, which in Uganda is about 3/4 of them. That model for prison village health teams has been taken by the Ugandan government and replicated in every prison in the country. With time, we asked, why is it that prisons are filled with poor people who don't have connections, who don't have education, who've often got mental illness, or they're vulnerable in other ways? And why is it that those who make the law and implement it seem to come from backgrounds of greater privilege? We wondered, what prejudices do we hold towards prisoners? In East Africa, like in the US, there's a presumption of innocence until proven guilty. It seemed that many people felt that there's no smoke without fire, and people wouldn't be in prison if they didn't deserve to be there. But in places where 80 or 90% of prisoners would never meet a lawyer, places where there are no juries, it didn't seem that justice was guaranteed. Over the years I've been doing this work, I've been asked thousands of times, why bother with those guys? You're working in banana republics, in places that don't look after their children, and good people who deserve support. Why bother with crooks and criminals? I think over the years my heart's been broken again and again as I've been formed and see this work as my calling. I talk about seeing people like Charles come out of the police station having been accused of theft with 3 fractures in his skull and most of his ribs and fingers are broken, bleeding out of his eyes and his ears and his bottom because of the way the police had beaten him. But in places where the police don't have enough resources to do their work, where if you want them to come and investigate a crime, you have to give them gas for their car. But still they're under pressure by the community to be seen to be making a safer society. Is it a surprise that they'd resort to torture to get confessions? I talk about the fact that the criminal justice system in countries like Uganda and Kenya, but around the Commonwealth, was established by the British as a means of controlling the local population, and that the laws are in many ways Dickensian. We work in prisons filled with vagrants and vagabonds and debtors and idlers. I remember when I was 19 and first started working in the women's prison in Kampala, meeting a girl the same age as me imprisoned with her small child. Apparently she'd borrowed money from a neighbour and she couldn't repay the loan, so she was in prison until she could. I talk of going to Juba Women's Prison in South Sudan. As the gate was opened, I saw a woman with chains on her arms and legs. I said to the officer accompanying me, "Why is this woman chained up?" They said, "Well, we chain up our lunatics, about a third of the prisoners." So this person's mad. It's taken to prison. There's no psychiatrist or mental health nurse, so you stay there indefinitely. But also those who are going to be executed. And although South Sudan's the world's youngest country, it still hangs people. So what will happen to this woman? The officer said, "Well, with her and a number of the other women here, she's not done anything wrong. But her husband was accused of a capital offence. But because the police couldn't catch him, they caught his wife, and she was tried and sentenced to die in his place." An Australian prison officer working with the United Nations in prisons in South Sudan told me about a 5-year-old child swimming in a river with a 3-year-old friend. The 3-year-old drowned. The 5-year-old was arrested and sentenced to death for murder. We do a lot of work with women in prison. I've been struck again and again by the fact that women living in rural communities whose children get sick will take them to the clinic or hospital, but find that there's no treatment for the child there. So the child dies, and then the mum's arrested for child neglect and taken to prison with the rest of her children. So given this situation, we thought, rather than making prisons better, what does it look like to get people out of them? What does it look like to take those who understand the power of the law because they've lived it? They know what it is maybe to have their fingernails pulled out in the police station or to be in prison for years without trial, and to give them high-quality legal education that they can apply to themselves and their communities. It seemed that lawyers were some of the people in society with the most agency and prisoners the least. A number of prisoners said, "I sold everything I had to pay my lawyer. The lawyer took the money and I've never seen him again." We saw that prison can be like a refiner's fire. It can destroy a sense of identity or self-esteem, but it can also build courage and boldness and compassion. We saw that throughout the ages, many remarkable people have spent time in detention and gone on to change many people's lives. I think about Mandela or Gandhi, or so many of the founders of the church. We realize, looking at the Bible, the people who made huge mistakes, people who are judged by their communities to be offenders, people like Paul or Rahab, had also been used by God in remarkable ways. So we thought, let's identify prisoners and prison staff who are already making a difference in their community, who are loving their neighbours as themselves. The prison officer who sees that women in her prison don't have sanitary towels, so she uses her small salary to buy them for them. Or the inmate who teaches the geography high school class on the stairs going up to the gallows on death row in Uganda. Let's find these people who are loving their neighbours and who have a vision for how they'll use the law and give them legal knowledge. Now I'm part of a community of more than 200 prisoners and prison officers in Uganda and Kenya who are working as paralegals, supported by my team of about 50 staff, mostly lawyers and legal academics. About 60 of us are studying for University of London law degrees by correspondence, as Nelson Mandela did, from prison in South Africa. In this summer's law exams with the University of London, it was the first in the UK to admit women. It has between 20 and 30,000 law students around the world. Our students had a 91% pass rate. I think the university's average is around 60%, despite the fact that for those on death row, we had to give them flashlights because they don't have light in their cells. Our students have been amongst the University of London's best performing students in human rights law and jurisprudence. We wondered, what does it look like each day to have our paralegals working on cases for their fellow inmates, writing appeals or making bail applications? In 2018, we've seen an average of about 250 people each month released from prison in Uganda and Kenya by the courts, having accessed legal services from members of our community. We wonder, what does it look like to work to change the law from prison? Susan Chigula, who was our first female University of London law student, was sentenced to death in Uganda when she was 21. It was clear that she was a leader. She led the church in prison and established a school. We got her admitted to the University of London in 2012. She became one of their best students in human rights law and established an informal legal aid clinic in her prison. She was the lead in a case, Susan Shigula and 417 others against the Republic of Uganda, which challenged the mandatory death sentence, the fact that anyone found guilty of murder or armed robbery had to be sentenced to death. It was successful. Mandatory death sentence was abolished, and Susan and hundreds of others were released from death row. She graduated with her University of London law degree in March of this year as a free woman. We wonder, what does it look like ultimately for people to leave prison and move into positions where they're the ones making and shaping and implementing the law, given their first-hand understanding of conflict with the state? Moses, our first man to graduate with his University of London LLB, has gone from being a prisoner in Uganda, using his legal knowledge to work on his appeal, having his conviction overturned, and he's now a prosecutor in the Ugandan army. There are no defense advocates there, but Moses knows what it means to be wrongly prosecuted. We believe that he brings a degree of empathy and compassion from his first-hand experience that other prosecutors might not have. Death row inmates in Uganda gave me the nickname a prisoner by choice, but I'm also a magistrate in the UK, a minor judge, and I send people to prison myself. We're a community made up of prisoners and prison staff, lawyers, academics, and allies like our patron, Cardinal Wamala. We receive support from the newly established Queen's Commonwealth Trust. And, sometimes it feels a bit surreal to think that the Queen or Prince Harry has spoken about our work and support us as we work in a community which sometimes feels forgotten by society. We believe that we can all play a part in making and shaping and implementing the law, regardless of what we've done or others have done to us. We're a community of people who've stolen, we've killed, we've tortured, and we've been tortured. We've been innocently imprisoned and sentenced to death. But we believe that for none of us does our past have to define our future. We believe that we can all play a part in creating a more just society. So each day we're studying law together. We wonder what it looks like to establish a prison-based legal college, to train a generation in law as it affects the poorest in society, and to send them out from prisons to the margins of society, saying, we're here to serve you. And if it can work in prisons, maybe it can work in refugee camps, or in homeless shelters, or in brothels, those who are used to suffering under the law, being given the opportunity to own it. We wonder, what does it look like to establish a law firm working in prison? How do we establish a financial model around this work? We've seen that when you give really poor people access to quality legal services, it means they're less likely to end up in prison, less likely to take up court time, and more likely to be back in the community supporting their families rather than being a burden on the state. We wonder, how do we demonstrate the impact of this work? So as we're approached by governments around Africa and around the world to bring our work to their countries, we say we can, but you need to pay for it, and this is why you need to pay. We've seen instances of ex-prisoners returning to prison with a chicken or a goat to thank the prison officer who went to court and spoke on their behalf and won them their freedom. Who would imagine that prison officers, who often we think of as being responsible for keeping prisoners in place, would take joy in going to court, speaking on a prisoner's behalf and securing their release? One of the ladies that we work with said, I used to torture prisoners. Now I've got legal knowledge. I take joy in going to court and speaking on their behalf and winning them their freedom. We believe that we all deserve a second chance. As we do this work, we wonder, how do we form our hearts in environments where corruption is a huge issue? As we acquire legal knowledge, which we know can be a pathway to power and status and wealth, how do we make the decision to give away a little of it as we journey to the margins of society? We're a community of people from very different backgrounds, some Catholic, some other members of the church, some Muslims, some Sikhs, some atheists, some agnostic. I think that we can all look to Jesus' example of loving the unloved and seeking justice for the oppressed, and it can make us strong as we go out with courage to serve. We're wondering what it looks like to form our hearts. How we grow as a community of reconciliation that's meant to hate each other. Who could imagine prisoners and prison officers sitting in class side by side studying law? but rather than hating each other, wants to grow in love. So we share meals together. Prisoners, prison staff, we invite judges and lawyers in with us to eat together. We take time to wash each other's feet, hoping that that can be our collective posture, that we humble ourselves. I think sometimes the law can make us a bit proud, saying, actually, this is a weapon for service. How do we get up close with those who are smelling or in pain or filled with shame and say, I'm here with you, the law will serve you too. We invite brothers from the Teze community to come and spend time in prison with us, leading us in times of worship, all seated on the floor of the prison cells, prison officers and prisoners side by side, all without our shoes on, having shared times of worship and silence and contemplation. We do Lectio Divina, prayerful way of reading the Bible, believing that God can speak to us now, just as we are, in the midst of our hope, our shame, our fears, our drunkenness, through the Bible. We're wondering what it looks like to welcome in those from outside, from around the world. We love to have volunteers and interns with us, to share this journey, to say, if it's possible in East Africa, isn't it possible where you live too? To put the power of the law into the hands of the poor, to give those that society has pushed aside the opportunity to acquire powerful legal knowledge. Let me introduce you to some of the members of my community. This is Moses, who I spoke of, our first graduate, of whom we're very proud, who has gone from prisoner to prosecutor in the Ugandan army. This is Rahab. She's in her Kenyan prison uniform. She's an armed robber. She accepted that she did it, and she went to prison for a number of years for it. And she said, when I went into prison, I was tough. You can see her. I don't know if she fully lost that toughness. But in prison, she became a paralegal, and she became our most effective paralegal at Langata Women's Prison in Nairobi. Not because she's the brightest or the most articulate, but because she's passionate, and because she's determined, and because she finds common cause with the women she was imprisoned alongside. She was released in October of last year, and now she works in our Kenya office, continuing to provide paralegal services. You can see her alongside Carol, second from the right, one of our lawyers in our Kenyan team, and one of the prison officers we work with at her prison. You can see her in our little legal aid clinic at Langata Women's Prison with the head of education for that prison. This is Paul Auriemma. He's been working in prisons in Uganda for something like 35 years. He said, when I was at school, I wanted to be a lawyer, but my family couldn't afford it. 3 or 4 years ago, we went into Auriemma prison, Paul's base, and we trained him and 2 other officers as paralegals. Within about 3 or 4 months of us giving them that training, more than 20% of that prison had been released because of Paul and his colleagues' efforts in going to court, mostly securing them bail. We're using the bicycles we've given them to cycle into the community, to be involved in alternate dispute resolution, bringing together the family of the offender and the victim and finding a way to resolve the problem between them. This is Ruth. I met her at this event about 2 years ago. We were launching a library that we'd established at the Women's Maximum Security Prison in Nairobi, and there was a fashion show. She arrived as the last participant dressed in this wedding dress. We saw that she had a talent for bringing joy to her fellow inmates, and she was a spoken word artist. She became a paralegal with us, and hugely motivated, despite the fact she'd only recently come out of high school and then been imprisoned, and she spent years in prison waiting for her trial. Last year, we had an event where we looked back on the year that had gone, and we celebrated what had gone well, and we remembered things that hadn't gone well, or people amongst us who had died. We gave each other flowers of appreciation. Ruth said, when I came into prison, I felt suicidal. It also happens to be a crime to try and kill yourself in Kenya, though that wasn't the reason why she was. Now I have great hope as I work to help my fellow inmates secure their release and be reunited with their families. I saw her about a month ago. After years of waiting trial, she'd gone to court and she'd been convicted. She was now waiting to be sentenced. She was quite fearful, and she said, actually, I've lost interest in being a paralegal now. I don't know what the future holds for me. And I tried somehow to quote Paul in Romans 5, I think, where he said, we rejoice in our suffering because suffering produces perseverance, and perseverance character, and character hope, and hope doesn't put us to shame. About 3 weeks ago, a judge sentenced Ruth to death. She now lives as a condemned woman in the condemned section. We believe that the future for her can be bright as we look to the example of Susan, our first lady to study law, who started out on death row with an uncertain future and now is a free woman. This is Susan graduating with her diploma in law from the University of London, while still a prisoner with a representative from the University of London, the head of Uganda prisons smiling proudly in the background, and Uganda's most senior judge just out of the picture next to him. Here she is with Ban Ki-moon. I was excited to see that he's coming to speak to you guys shortly. This is Wilson, who led a similar case to Susan, but in Kenya, challenging the mandatory death sentence, and there too, it's been overturned. This is Justice Winifred Nabisindi. She's a High Court judge in Uganda. We've been working with her for 4 or 5 years. She oversees justice in the mid-northern region of Uganda. When we went into that region, it had the longest backlog of people awaiting trial. She said, I want to do justice, but if I hear from the prosecutor, and then I ask the defendant what they have to say, but they don't realize that they can speak, or they're just kneeling down because they don't even realize they can stand in my presence, it's difficult for me to do justice. Help these people to make their voices heard so that my fellow judges and I can do justice. Now the mid-northern region of Uganda has the lowest backlog of people awaiting their day in court, since our paralegals went in and provided support to Justice Nabisindi and that community. This is a clip of a church on death row in Uganda. It shows my wife, my son when he was about 2. He spent his first Easter Sunday when he was 4 months old there, and some of my colleagues from the African Prisons Project worshipping with prisoners. You'll notice that although there's a large number of condemned inmates there, the church is just on the other side from the gallows, which is on the left through the door next to it. There's no staff around. The inmates are singing the first song. The video lasts for about 1.5 minutes. The first song is, I love you, Jesus, you're my saviour. They then sing, Jesus number 1. And today come to Jesus, tomorrow will never end. Oh, I'm sorry. Kevin, thank you. Oh no, I've done it. This next clip shows some of our University of London students at Committee Prison in Kenya. I know that some of you might struggle with their accents as they speak English. Apologies if that's the case, but I think as much as it's a privilege for me to have this platform and share something of our experiences, those I work alongside are much more articulate as they reflect on their lives and how they're using the law to serve others. In blue, there's a chap called Pete. He was our first undergraduate law student in Kenya. He graduated in 2014 with his diploma in law from the University of London. The Kenyan Supreme Court judge came to prison for the ceremony, and many journalists were there. A labourer working for a Chinese construction site in Nairobi saw Pete's graduation on television And it came to mind some months later when a dog belonging to the manager of his worksite bit him. I said to the manager, "Your dog's injured me. I need you to pay for my medical treatment." The manager said, "I won't pay and you're fired." This man had only been earning a few dollars a day, and now he had no income, so he knew that a lawyer wasn't a possibility for him. But he remembered Pete, so he went to Committee Maximum Prison and said to the guards at the gate, "You've got a lawyer in here. I'd like to see him." So they let him in and he explained his case to Pete. And Pete sued his former employer from prison, getting him a payment of about $10,000, equivalent to maybe 3 or 4 years' salary for that man. We wonder, is there an opportunity for us to do civil law as a way of subsidizing the... Welcome back everyone. Sorry about that interruption. I'm still looking for us to finish around 1:30, so I'll briefly share this video clip with you, as I said, which features Peter, our first Kenyan law student, who supported that labourer in Nairobi in getting a result which I think he couldn't have imagined when he was unfairly dismissed by his employer. And then I'll briefly share some quotes which have sustained me, many members of our community, as we've done this work.
I'm Peter Oko, 44 years, been serving a life sentence, and I was charged and convicted for the offense of murder. And I'm doing my second year in LLB now, having completed my diploma in law at the University of London. When I got that admission and got my student number, so I knew now I'm a student, the next part was now on me to do the studies and to pass the exams. In committee, you can use the library, well-stocked library by APP. You can use the school. You can also create your own space.
For now, we are covering criminal law and common law reasoning. So we begin at around 8:30. The class takes 2 hours. We make each one of us a lecturer.
You could be answering about negligence manslaughter instead of answering about constructive manslaughter, just because you didn't identify the proper problem.
These prisoners will be able to help the other prisoners to do small things like writing up their appeals, and even if they can, representing themselves in court.
A country's civilization, I believe, is judged by how it treats its prisoners. In the early 90s, an inmate going to visit someone, you had to be chained to an officer. Going to court, you had to be chained to an officer. Now that chain has been removed, we are chained by education, and we regard the officers as teachers. We call them teachers.
We believe we can reach out to these prisoners because they came to prison not for punishment, but for rehabilitation. Many have sat down and looked back into their lives, and they've decided they need to change. We need to give them that chance to make that change.
I'm a convicted to suffer death. Most of us, they engage themselves into crime. Maybe they are naive, maybe to their primitiveness, ignorance. But at the end of the day, what counts? What counts is, who am I now? The way we came in is not the way we are now.
I find it very humbling that we started something. I was a pioneer. I trailblazed the path, and now there are people coming up. I mean, it's about mentorship. I'm old enough. I don't have to stay here like a dinosaur, you know. So these guys here who are being sponsored by APP, I don't think anyone will be asking what were they doing in committee. Why were they in committee in the first place? It's after what they've learned. How do they want to impact on society? So there'll be alumni of the University of London together with Mandela. He has his number in the University of London. I have mine. They have theirs.
Behind these walls, behind the prison walls, we have brains. We have brains that can move mountains.
I think working in prisons, I've learned a lot about the importance of being present to the people and experiences I'm having now. I think often it can be tempting for me to think about what happens in many years' time, to have big dreams for the future. But I think in prisons or in hospices, what we have is today. And this prayer found on the body of a nun called Sister Odette, who was murdered in Algeria, speaks powerfully to me and to many of us at the African Prisons Project about the power of being present. Live today's day. God gives it to you. It belongs to you. Live it in Him. Tomorrow's day belongs to God. It doesn't belong to you. Do not impose today's worry upon tomorrow. Tomorrow belongs to God. Hand it over to Him. The present moment is a frail footbridge. If you weigh it down with yesterday's regrets, tomorrow's anxiety, the footbridge gives way and you lose your footing. The past, God forgives it. The future, God gives it. Live today's day in communion with Him. And I leave you with this Franciscan blessing. In many ways, it's a manifesto for us as a community. Whenever I'm in prison, I share it with those I work alongside. I think it challenges us about how we might live our lives. May God bless you with discomfort at easy answers, half-truths, and superficial relationships, so that you may live deep within your hearts. May God bless you with anger at injustice, oppression, and exploitation of people, so that you may work for justice, freedom, and peace. May God bless you with tears to shed for those who suffer pain, rejection, hunger, and war, so that you may reach out your hands to comfort them, to turn their pain to joy. May God bless you with enough foolishness to believe that you can make a difference in the world, to believe that you can do that which others say cannot be done, to bring justice and kindness to all our children and the poor. Amen.